Hello, this is Dr. James Billis. Today we're going to cover Chapter 20, The Heart, from the textbook Fundamentals of Anatomy and Physiology, 11th edition. The cardiovascular system is made up of the heart, blood, and blood vessels. The heart beats approximately 100,000 times a day, pumping approximately 8,000 liters of blood per day. It consists of the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Pulmonary circuit meaning we're going to and from the lungs. Systemic circuit, we're going to and from everything else but the lungs. This picture here is showing us the pulmonary circuit versus the systemic circuit. It's colored down here, showing the systemic arteries in red, the systemic veins in blue, the pulmonary arteries in purple, the pulmonary veins in, well, kind of an orange color. It's kind of confusing. Remember that arteries carry blood away from the heart, and veins return blood to the heart. Now, with that in mind, let's go back to this picture. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. We like to think in terms of red as being oxygenated blood, and blue as being deoxygenated blood. As a matter of fact, in anatomy, when you dissect cats, or a lot of times what they'll do is they'll put dyes in the arteries, red dye, and then a blue dye in the veins. But now this changes, and you can see that the systemic arteries are red here and the veins are blue. But in the pulmonary system, that changes. In the pulmonary system, you can see that the veins are more orange versus the pulmonary arteries being blue. So what's happening in the pulmonary system, it flip-flops to where the arteries are no longer red, but they're considered to be blue. And then the veins are considered to be red. It's the difference between oxygenated versus deoxygenated. And we'll cover this a little bit more. Hopefully that didn't confuse you. Just remember, arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood to the heart. Now we talk about the capillaries. As we go through the heart, we can see this large artery here. The ascending, and then the descending to be down here. The ascending aorta, and then it gives rise to smaller arteries, and as we go through the body, it gets to even smaller arteries, and then we get to the capillaries. And they have names. We'll go over them in a bit. Let's go back. Until we come to the capillaries. The capillaries are the smallest area between the veins and the arteries, and this is where they're exchange vessels. We exchange dissolved gases, nutrients, and waste between the blood and surrounding tissues. They interconnect the smallest arteries and smallest veins. Okay. Capillaries. Now you can imagine that there's a lot of pressure as we squeeze blood from the heart out through the aorta here. That's pretty well pressurized, and it is, until we get to the capillaries, and there's not as much pressure at the capillaries. And then we come into the venous side, and there's very little pressure in the venous side. Lots of pressure, arterial side, not so much pressure in the venous side. Okay, the heart is a four-chambered organ. It's a muscle. Consists of the right atrium, the right ventricle, left atrium, and left ventricle. So if we can find a good picture here. Still not what I'm looking for. Oh, there we go. We have the atriums, two atriums, left and right above here, and the ventricles left and right below. So the atriums sit on top, the ventricles sit below the atrium. Get back up here. The right atrium receives blood from the systemic circuit. The right ventricle pumps blood to the pulmonary circuit. The left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary circuit. The left ventricle pumps blood to the systemic circuit. Kind of hard to understand right now, but we'll cover it to where you'll have a better understanding. The heart itself has great vessels connected at the base or the superior portion of the heart. This would be the base with the great vessels connected to it at the superior end of the heart versus the apex, the point of the heart, at the inferior end, which is what it's saying here, sits between two pleural cavities in the mediastinum. So this is the mediastinum. We indicated that this was the thoracic cavity, this area here, and within that thoracic cavity, the abdominal pelvic cavity below, within the thoracic cavity we have the pleural spaces or cavities as well as the mediastinum, which contains the heart and the vessels. Let's see if there's anything important here we can look at. You'll notice that the heart is not directly positioned in the center of the body. It in fact, well, here it kind of looks like it is, but it in fact sits over to the left-hand side, a little more than the right. And it's because of that difference there that we see when we look at the lungs, we see on the right side 3 lobes versus the left side 2 lobes. That's because this heart is taking up a little bit more space on the left side. In this a little bit more orientation here, we see the diaphragm here. Keep in mind that the diaphragm is a muscle, and when it contracts and relaxes, what it's doing is it's pulling the lungs down as air goes in through the mouth and fills those lungs up. But keep in mind also, not only is it filling those lungs and releasing the air, but it's also squeezing all of the abdominal pelvic contents when it does this, as well as the heart. So there's a mechanical action going on here when we breathe, or when that diaphragm contracts and relaxes. That affects all the organs of the body. The pancreas, the liver, the spleen, everything is being squeezed as if somebody's reaching inside there and just squeezing those things to get their the fluid or the chemistry that's in them to secrete where it needs to go. So something big picture, keep that in mind. Okay, let's just continue here. Well, before we go on, let's look at some of these vessels. This is the ascending aorta, very large. This is the vena cava, that superior vena cava, coming down into, bringing blood back down into the heart. The aorta is pumping blood out to the system. Here we're coming back into the heart. There's also an inferior vena cava that we don't see here. Okay. Here we're talking about a pericardium and a pericardial cavity. The pericardium surrounds the heart. It's the outer fibrous pericardium, and then there's an inner fiber or inner serous pericardium, which has an outer parietal layer and an inner visceral layer. Let's see if we can talk about this. There we go. So what we're talking about is that we've got a serous, a parietal layer of serous. When we speak serous or speak of serous, you're thinking some type of fluid that's going to reduce friction. Okay, so here we've got a hand in a balloon. What's going on here? Well, it's basically saying, okay, this is the heart. And there is a lining pushed right up against the heart. And then there's a cavity, and then there's a lining that's not pushed up against the heart, but it's away from the heart. So we see here, we've got a lining against the heart and a lining away from the heart with a cavity in here. So to get an understanding, we always talk about the organs as being viscera, and anytime there's a lining against the viscera, we start it off by saying visceral layer. So that's what we're talking about here. Visceral layer of the serous pericardium. So it's the pericardium, but it is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. And as we move on to the outside, we have the outer wall, which is the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. So they're both serous pericardium. We don't want friction in this area here. And then we have, in the center, we have an air space. It says air space, which corresponds to the parietal or pericardial cavity. That's if it's a balloon. With the heart, we have a fluid in here. Okay, again, we see the apex of the heart. And that'll give you a better understanding of that. Hopefully. So we have the pericardium, which surrounds the heart, has an outer fibrous pericardium, an inner serous pericardium, which has the parietal layer and the visceral layer, and then the pericardial layer, or cavity, between the parietal and visceral layers, which contains pericardial fluid. It's not air like it was showing you with the hand. Get a little oriented here with this picture before we go too much further. We have here a vertebra, the body of the vertebra, spinous process. Let's see, we have the spinal cord in the central canal. We have ribs over here, sternum here, duplicate over here, transverse processes here and pedicles of the vertebra. Here we have the esophagus, the bronchus of the lungs, branching out into what's called the bronchioles. And here we have the aortic arch, and then it's been dissected here and recovers again here. So we have the aortic arch with the segment removed. Here we have the pulmonary trunk. And it branches out into the left pulmonary arteries and the right pulmonary artery. Now here this picture has this as being the right atrium and the left atrium. They're in fact not the right atrium and the left atrium. They are what's called auricles, which kind of reminds anatomists of the ear. They in fact can enlarge and inflate, but they sit on top of the atriums. So we have the auricles, which right and left auricles, which sit on top of the atrium. And then it discusses this being the right ventricle and left ventricle. Yes, they are the right and left ventricles, but we're not seeing the atrium here. And that gives us a little bird's eye view of this transverse section. Superior view of the organs in the mediastinum. Portions of the lungs have been removed to reveal blood vessels and airways. The heart is located in the anterior part of the mediastinum, immediately posterior to the sternum. So we said this is the mediastinum, anterior portion, right behind the sternum. We talk about itis. If I say itis, you think inflammation. We're talking about cardi. If I say cardi, your medical terminology for cardi is heart. So we have pericarditis is caused by pathogens, inflammation of the heart, caused by pathogens in the pericardium. Inflamed pericardial surfaces rub against each other. We don't want that. We don't want friction in there, producing indistinct or distinctive scratching sounds. May lead to cardiac tamponade, restricted movement of the heart due to excess fluid in the pericardial cavity. Let's see, the superficial anatomy of the heart. Two thin-walled atria, we talked about, being the left and the right, which sit on top of the ventricles, each with an expandable outer auricle, which I just discussed with you, looking like ears, sitting on top of the atria. We have sulci, which are grooves, which contain fat and blood vessels. Let me get to one of those. Yes, right here is a groove, and on top of that groove is fat and vessels. So we're talking about a sulcus. We have a sulcus over here. Excuse me. The coronary sulcus. So the sulcus is a groove containing fats and vessels. The coronary sulcus marks the border between the atria and the ventricles. Coronary sulcus between the atrium and the ventricle. A reminder, this is not the atrium, it's the auricle. The anterior interventricular sulcus, and then there's a posterior intraventricular sulcus, mark the borders between the left and the right ventricles. So we have a right and a left ventricle. Right ventricle, left ventricle, the sulcus separates them. Now if we were to turn this heart around, we'd see that on the back side, as we do here. The sulcus separating the left and the right ventricle, which is the posterior interventricular sulcus, meaning between the two ventricles. Okay. Here we see some anatomical positioning of the heart, and key as far as when you listen, when you listen to the heart with a stethoscope, you have key points that you want to put that stethoscope to hear different parts of the heart. And we'll get to those here in a bit. But we see that the apex of the heart, the point of the heart, inferior portion, is between the fourth and the fifth rib, or within that intercostal space. Okay. A little more familiarization with the anatomy. Right ventricle, left ventricle, those are the lower chambers. Right atrium underneath the auricle. Left atria underneath the auricle, left auricle here. We have the ascending aorta. And off the ascending aorta, we've got 1, 2, 3 vessels. You need to learn. Brachiocephalic trunk is the first. Left common carotid is the second. And the left subclavian artery would be the third. And then as we make our loop and start coming down, we no longer call it the ascending aorta, we call it the descending aorta. And we think, okay, it's red, it's carrying blood away from the heart to the system. Here we have the pulmonary trunk, which gives rise to the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. And even though we're calling those arteries, they're not carrying oxygenated blood. They're carrying deoxygenated blood as it's moving away from the heart. The blood is moving away from the heart. Therefore, we call it an artery, even though we're looking at it as a blue vein. Try not to get confused with that. Okay, we've got the sulcus. We've talked about the coronary sulcus. We've talked about the interventricular sulcus. The superior vena cava. Again, we don't see the inferior vena cava down here. Let's continue. Same thing. Identification, we're just looking at a picture of a real heart. So we've got right ventricle here, left ventricle over here, the right auricle covering the right atrium, left auricle covering the left atrium, ascending aorta, 3 branches, the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid artery, the left subclavian artery, and then the pulmonary trunk giving rise to the pulmonary left and right pulmonary arteries. Here's an interesting structure here. Take note. It's a ligament, and that ligament is connected right there. And it's holding, let's see, we're going to call that the ligamentum arteriosum. And it holds those two together. The ligamentum arteriosum. Okay, we've got some new structures here as we look at arteries and veins surrounding the heart. Arteries and veins surrounding the heart. Now, the heart is a muscle, just like any other muscle. It needs a blood supply. We looked at the muscles of the legs, the arms, different areas of the body, and they have a artery or blood supply because they need oxygen. The heart is the same way. It needs blood. It needs its own blood supply. And the blood supply for the heart is the coronary system. So when we talk about coronary arteries and veins, we're talking about the specific arteries and veins that go to the heart and feed it its oxygen or take the deoxygenated blood away. So we have here, we're seeing the left coronary artery. We have a right coronary artery over here, and we'll get more into the arteries in a bit. Looking at the posterior side of the heart, let's identify some structures. The superior vena cava. Now we can see the inferior vena cava. Right atrium, auricle on top of the atrium. Left auricle on top of the atrium. Ascending aorta. I'm going to say this is the left atrium. Fat vessels in the coronary sulcus, here, interventricular sulcus here, posterior interventricular sulcus, containing the fat and the vessels. Let's see, left pulmonary artery, right pulmonary artery. Left pulmonary veins, right pulmonary veins. There we go. Coronary arteries, which supply the heart itself, are shown in red. Coronary veins are shown in blue. Important structure here as we're coming in from the coronary vein. We reach this structure here, which is just about ready to drop into the right atrium, which is the coronary sinus. So as blood is coming through the venous system back to the heart, one of the last places it goes before it drops into the heart again, for as far as the coronary blood supply, is the coronary sinus, and then it'll drop in. We actually have much more blood coming in from the superior vena cava, which covers the upper portion of the head and trunk, or not trunk, but and then the inferior, which is bringing venous blood up from the system. Okay. We've kind of covered this already. The heart wall consists of 3 distinct layers. And what we're doing is we're taking a section out here and blowing it up, taking a look at it. As we look at this layer here, we've got the cavity that we talked about here, which just has the fluid in it. We have the endocardium, which is inside the heart. The myocardium, and remember myo means muscle, cardi, heart. We're talking about the muscular portion of the heart with the muscle cells. Remember we talked about skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. We said that cardiac muscle was similar to skeletal muscle. One of the differences in being able to view these is between the cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle was these branches that you see crossing through these cells, these lines. We call those intercalated discs, and those hold the different cells together. So there's several cardiac cells here, but they grab a hold of one another and are held together and work together, but they're held together with these intercalated discs. And we come out here to the outer portion, which is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. Visceral layer of the serous pericardium. And we said that the serous pericardium was that whole balloon that covered the hand. So we have the portion that's against the organ, which is this visceral layer of the serous pericardium. And then we have the parietal layer of the serous pericardium here. So more of a review for you on that one. The muscles of the heart itself. The atrial musculature forms bands that wrap around the atrium in a figure-8 pattern, as you can see here. So when those muscles contract, you can kind of get a sense of how they're going to squeeze things in the heart and around the heart. The ventricle musculature forms bands that spiral around the ventricles. So we can see that when those contract, it's basically squeezing both the left and right ventricles at the same time. Whereas when the atrium contract, they're squeezing at the same time, but not necessarily at the same time as the ventricles. We'll get into that a little bit further here as we go to. So the cardiac muscle tissue forms concentric layers that wrap around the atria or spiral within the walls of the ventricles. And connective tissues of the heart. They physically support cardiac muscle fibers, blood vessels, and nerves of the myocardium, distribute forces of contraction, add strength, and prevent overexpansion of the heart, provide elasticity that helps return heart to normal size and shape after contraction. The connective tissue of the heart. There's got to be some constraints on that as far as how far it expands or contracts. There's a cardiac skeleton. There's 4 dense bands of tough elastic tissue. They encircle the heart valves and bases of the pulmonary trunk and aorta, stabilize the positions of the heart valves and ventricle muscular cells, electrically insulate ventricular cells from the atrial cells. And we'll see a picture of that a little later as we go through here. And I'll remind you of it being a skeleton. Okay, we have internal anatomy and organization. We have chambers of the heart, which are separated by muscular partitions called the septa. We have the interatrial septa, which separates the atriums, left and right. And we have the interventricular septum, which separates the ventricles. And it says much thicker than intraatrial septum. Yes, much. Let's see if we can find a picture here. This is good enough. So we're saying we've got between the right and the left atrium, we've got like a wall, a separation, which is the septum. We can't see it in this picture, but we can see between the right and the left ventricles the wall or septum that separates the two ventricles. But when we look at this is a good time to talk about it. When we look at this, we see that this separation is as thick as the wall of the left ventricle. But the right ventricle is not as thick. Okay, here's what's going on. We're only moving blood from the right ventricle to the lungs. So when we squeeze, we only have a short distance to go, just to the lungs, which are right next to the heart. We're going right here on each side. That's not very far. It doesn't require much muscle to push the same volume of blood that's in the left ventricle is in the right ventricle. We're pushing the same amount, we just don't have that far to go. With the left ventricle, we have to supply blood all the way out and down to the feet. So we're supplying blood to the rest of the system, which is a long ways away from just where the lungs are. So the left ventricle has got to be stronger than the right. Therefore, it's got a thicker muscle. Okay. Much thicker than the intraatrial septum, which we just saw. Okay. The AV valves, AV standing for atrioventricular valves. So that must be the valves that are between the atrium and the ventricles. Valves between the atrium and the ventricle. And these are the cusps of those valves. So we have valves here and valves here. When they close, they separate the blood from the atrium and the ventricle on both sides. And then we have valves here, which we're going to talk about too. There's the pulmonary valve, and we can't see it here, but there's also this same type of valve in the opening of, right behind here,